Professor Michèle Lamont, who is a professor of sociology and American and African American Studies, and Robert I. Gottman Professor of European Studies at Harvard University, speaking about recognition globally. So thank you so much for joining us, Professor Lamont, and you can share your screen.
Okay, well, first I want to thank l'Institut d'études avancées for welcoming me for a month. It's an absolute treat to be with you on Ile Saint-Louis and to have a chance to focus on one paper during this period. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about my intellectual agenda in general. Then I'll zoom on into a book that came out in September 23 on which I'm building. It's a book that's about recognition. And then I'll conclude with telling you about the paper that I'm going to be working on in the next month. So I'm a sociologist of inequality, but my expertise is to focus on how culture contributes to the reproduction of inequality. And this first slide here shows you different ways that sociologists are thinking about the reproduction of inequality. The type 1 processes is what Marx and Weber wrote about, taught in all basic introduction to inequality, exploitation, alienation in Marx, or domination, closure, opportunity hoarding in Weber. And this is often associated with economic inequality, and it's embedded in relations of production. Classical sociology. The second process is basically what's happened in the sociology of inequality since the 70s. Largely, the impetus came from the work of Bourdieu, and the focus was very much to look at the ways in which culture, class struggle is expressed it's in everyday life, in interactions between people of various class, and the role of cultural capital, symbolic capital in reproducing inequality. My work really contributes to the type 3 processes that is really about, again, we had exploitation, domination, now we have identification, racialization, stigmatization. These are also cultural processes that have to do with meaning making, and they are produced, in interaction, and they are often the unintended effect of other interactions that human beings have with each other. And the paper that is cited at the bottom of this slide really makes a big push to make a case that sociologists need to really, theorize much more systematically about these cultural processes, which is basically the research agenda that I've pursued for the last 10 years, 10, 15 years, or even longer. This second slide really gives you one possible take on the field of inequality as it exists today. The cultural and social processes on the left tells you what I've just described, but there's many, many other paths through which inequality is produced. And the point here is to say it's not a question of, identity politics versus material resources. We know that the discipline is very much grounded in materialist assumption with, starting with Marxism. But in fact, I'm very much someone who's advocating for multi-causal understanding of the production of inequality. My work feeds into this as well as the work of many other people. Actually, I'm talking to you from London, where I am for the retirement conference of Mike Savage, who's a colleague who's also contributed a lot to all of this. So it's in this context, after having written a number of papers that are really about these cultural processes, papers written for my peers in sociology, that I decided to write a book titled Seeing Others, which came out in the fall of 2023. And this book is about recognition. It's a trade book. I decided to write it for Penguin and uh, Simon and Schuster. And the idea during the first Trump presidency, I felt like general readers need to have tools to understand one of these central processes, which is the process of recognition. And the white cover, which is the American cover, the design depicts very well what the book is about, which is basically that it's a book about how can we broaden the circle of people who feel that they belong. So the black circle represents, those who feel that they are worthy, that they have full cultural membership, and you have groups of different size and colors that are more or less distant from the center. So the puzzle that, or the lesson that the book teaches to the general reader is really what can we do to help this to happen, to broaden cultural uh, membership. And the Penguin book, the subtitle is the correct one, How to Redefine Worth in a Divided World. That's the challenge of the book. Whereas the American subtitle is totally wrong. They wanted to put, and how it can heal a divided world, so they could advertise the book in the self-help section on Amazon, which is not something I really cared about. But to go back to the basic definition, there's huge literature. You may have heard about the debate between Nancy Fraser and Axel Honneth, both philosophers, on the politics of recognition and distribution. So one basic definition is that the recognition is the social act by which we can recognize the positive social worth of individuals in group. But the point here is that this is an intersubjective process. It's acknowledged by others. The counterpoint, the other side of the coin, if you want, is stigmatization, which is also a process that happens all the time as we lead our lives, associated with the work of sociologist Irving Goffman, and it's about negatively qualifying people. So our social identity, as we experience it, is the result of both how we self-define and how other groups define us. So group categorization and self-definition are always in interaction. And through this, we define our social identity. And this social identity often has components that have to do with recognition and stigmatization. And there's shared scripts that we have in society that tell us about the relative values of various groups, whether we can think about deeply stigmatized groups like homelessness, people, low-income groups, and other groups whose, status is highly contested. We can think of what Trump is doing now with trans people, with undocumented immigrants, etc. So the valences of the various groups is moving all the time. So my book is written in the context where there's been an explosion of social movements on the left and the right of the political spectrums, where groups that feel that they're being disrespected, have been treated unfairly, have taken the street to engage in recognition claim, to assert their dignity. So you have Black Lives Matter and Me Too, but on the right side of the political spectrum, you have, of course, the MAGA movement, which is very much associated with lower middle class, working class people who feel that their dignity has not been respected, and they are embracing nationalism as a way to raise their status. So in this book, I became very interested during the first Trump presidency. I was a little depressed, so I read the literature in the social science on where people find hope. And I found that essentially exposure to alternative narratives about what the future will look like plays a really crucial role in mental health, because it allows people to imagine alternative futures. And therefore, the production of narrative, the production of alternative narrative is extremely important. So for this book, I decided to focus precisely on people whose job it is to create alternative narratives. So here, the person with the white T-shirt is Zachary Drucker, who worked as a consultant for the show Transparent, which describes the life of a trans woman, advanced middle age, who's negotiating her new identity with her adult children. And when I interviewed Joy Soloway, who created that show, they told me they created that show precisely to spread recognition for trans people, to make them more understandable so that they are not viewed as aberrant. So for this book, I interviewed with my research team 185 people, professional change agents, whose role is specifically to create alternative narratives in a context where the American dream was really, declining after 2008. Many millennials know that they will never be able to buy a house. So the search for alternative narratives became extremely important for that generation and Gen Z. So that's basically what the book is about. The other black T-shirt is a T-shirt that expresses something that in the book I call ordinary universalism, with slogans such as "Love is love," which was very central to the same-sex marriage movement. "No human is illegal." These are all slogans that in some ways are expression of various forms of ordinary universalism, which I contrast with like Enlightenment universalism. So it's the way everyone, ordinary people, think about what brings all of us together. And this book focuses on the liberal and progressive end of the political spectrum, in part because there were books that were really focusing on the more conservative end. I'll talk about this at the end. The book also draws on interviews with Gen Zs conducted during the pandemic and during the Black Lives Matter movement, college students who were overall quite progressive. And what the book highlights is how inclusion and authenticity as really being celebrated in these new narratives and replacing as an alternative to the American dream in a context where this pursuit of upward mobility is not possible anymore. So we interviewed people working in a range of organizational fields where such narratives of inclusion and authenticity are being conducted. It also includes academia. So you should get the book to see what this sample looks like. We had enormous luck because it was the pandemic. No one was working. We were able to interview a lot of very influential people, like the woman who was the head of Netflix at the global level, who decided to diffuse Black Panthers across the world, or Mike Schur, who created The Good Place and, Park and Recreation, a lot of very influential people. And the book focuses on three different strategies for broadening cultural membership. I don't have time to describe all of them to you, but I'll just say that in the context of neoliberalism, you have a highly institutionalized, omnipresent script about who we're supposed to be as people, which is focused on social economic success, meritocracy, self-reliance. It's in some ways incorporated in the person of Trump, but this script has a very negative effect for people who don't have college degrees. So the college degree has come to operate as a closure system, a caste system in the American context, where people who don't have a college degree experience themselves very much as lacking recognition, as being looked down upon. So the stigmatization of the working class and low-income people has spread like fire, which we can see in the data on the mental health or death by despair that Anne Case and Angus Deaton have written about, at the same time as the upper middle class has become ever more hegemonic. There's a study of the content of entertainment television that shows that over the last 50 years, the number of characters in entertainment television that depicts people other than professionals and managers has been really minuscule. We always are celebrating people like us, college-educated professionals and managers. So in this context, there's really a need to think about who else can be worthy besides college-educated professionals and managers. And what we see is the emergence of a lot of alternative narratives. So I'll just give you one example. If you go on YouTube, you can type question bridge and you will see this video produced by an African-American artist who asked 125 Black people, Black men across the United States, what does it mean for you to be a Black man? And he found that there were basically nothing in common except for the fact that they all experience microaggression on a daily basis. But what's really important, so this project was very much meant to challenge the stereotype of Black men as a source of problem. But what's really interesting about this project is that the artist, Hank Willis Thomas, joined forces with an organization called the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, and they took this YouTube video and showed it across over 2,000 community centers and high school across the US. And their goal was really to scale up the narrative and to create discussions around the stereotype of Black men. So the book argues that there's recognition chains that are created connecting cultural producers and philanthropies that are really focused on changing narratives and scaling up narratives. So the Ford Foundation played a very important role in this when Darren Walker became president of the Ford Foundation, which is one of the largest foundations in the US. He right away decided that his goal was to attack inequality, and he would do that through four pillars. And one of them is what he called changing arts and mind by using narratives. And that was quite novel because a lot of foundations were simply funding economists to do redistribution. And now suddenly the transformation of narratives came to take a very, very central role in how the attack against inequality was going to take shape. So another part of the book focuses on this narrative of ordinary universalism by looking at the Gen Zs and what they did to try to change narratives. And of course, during the pandemic, especially, those 80 people we interviewed, we have a paper that really details how they think about their lives and what kind of world they want to live in. And they certainly emphasize the American dream and the therapeutic ethos, but they also embrace ordinary universalism, the idea that we should, so it's a group that is really, really progressive. So this is nothing new, but I'm mentioning this to you to tell you about the project I'm going to work on now. These narratives that I described, they are populating our world, they are everywhere, and they are really trickling down and influencing how people are experiencing everyday life. This is a poster that you could find everywhere in the US during the pandemic. But now we've got Trump, so of course people are very discouraged. They feel that these narratives of inclusion have disappeared. So I decided to put together a project where I would look at the paths through which people can seek recognition in the current context in the US. And before the last election, we put together with my research assistant a research project where we looked at the non-college educated young people 18 to 30 in Manchester, New Hampshire, Manchester, UK, and in Tampere, Finland, which is Manchester, Finland. And the idea is to look at these very young people that Trump has been courting to see whether and how they seek recognition through politics. And there's other research projects that I won't have time to describe to you, but the whole project is organized around paired case studies, and it's a good book on recognition globally that I hope to be able to write over the next few years. But what I will do while at the Institut d'Études Avancées is to write the chapter that is based on the 45 interviews that we've completed in Manchester, New Hampshire. And the interviews in Manchester, UK have been delayed a little bit because of IRB, so I won't be able to write about this during this month. But we have a number of hypotheses that allows us to compare the workers in both places. And just to give you a brief overview of some of the things we find, one of our questions, we really are interested in whether and how they seek recognition through politics in both places with a number of hypotheses. And first, we find that in general, they draw very strong boundaries about politics. They associate politics with corruption. And you can see here some of the words. They want to stay away from it because they think it's drama, it's really producing anxiety, etc. But what we find in New Hampshire is that they draw very strong boundaries toward people below, very strong boundaries, but they also identify with people above. They admire people who are rich like Trump, and they very much embrace the American dream, even if they know that it's going to be very hard for them to achieve. And at the same time, we ask them, how do you define yourself as working class? They don't really know what working class person is. And we even ask them, do you belong to unions? A great many of them don't even know what unions are. So this leads us to think about group identity. And we find that their class identity is extremely weak. And we had chosen Manchester, New Hampshire, and Manchester, UK, because being the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution in both countries, we thought that the place identity would really reinforce class identity. But we don't find this at all in Manchester, New Hampshire. So the path through recognitions that we're describing in our research is both people who are gaining recognition through exclusion by identifying with Trump, as Trump tells them in a situation of zero sum, we don't have resource for anyone but Native Americans, people who are from the US, white people from the US. So we're not going to support Gaza, we're not going to support Ukraine, we're not going to support immigrants. So a lot of what they embrace is this politics of we take our care of our own. The recognition through inclusion, very few of the people we interviewed support this. They support, solidarity toward people of color and LGBTQI, but this was a very small number of our respondents. And we did these interviews between May in December of 2024, so really in the middle of the elections and just after. But one of the most interesting aspects of the project is really that they seek recognition by defining themselves as above it or by keeping a lot of distance toward politics. So most of the next 3 weeks will be spent doing a very detailed analysis of the interview transcripts where we can try to understand better this relationship to recognition. A lot of the political science literature on these questions talks about low information voters or voters who lack political efficacy. So a lot of the analysis is about what workers lack and what prevents them from being involved in politics. And instead, what we're trying to do here is to really illuminate how their need for recognition helps us understand how they get involved in politics and how they justify what they're doing. So, and there's hypotheses that really come from our understanding of their sense of groupness and how the structure for groupness in the working class in the US and the UK works very, very differently. I don't have time to describe to you now, but I can develop this a little bit in the Q&A if you're interested. So these are my collaborators, Andrew Miles and Hilary Pilkington, who are sociologists of class in the far right at the University of Manchester, and some of the research assistants who are participating in the project. So I think my time is up, right? Am I right, Sadi? Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll stop now. I'm sorry this is such a rapid fire delivery explanation of what I'm doing, but hopefully it gives you a sense of where I'm heading.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Um, yes, that is for the first question.
So should I?
Thank you, Michelle, for this great presentation. I think it's extremely timely, as you aptly noted. And so my comment and question would be, so you've started presenting recognition and stigmatization as a social process where you are actually uh, qualified or rewarded by others as being a good member of the group in a way, right?
Mhm.
But this is also what matters from an individual perspective is the perception also of that qualification, of that recognition. Like, am I really recognized? Is that fair? Is that okay? Right? And in the past, I mean, you could be an underdog, but that was fine because for religious reasons or societal cultural reasons, as you say, it was okay to be an underdog. Like if you're in the wrong, class or like in India, for example, it wouldn't be okay. So my comment here is that what you try naturally to do, and this is very well described in Tashfield's theory of social identity. You probably want to find a group where you are recognized. So if you're not recognized in your group, you want to go to another group. Or if your group is a bad group in a way, you want to change groups, right? That's what Tashfield noted. And so what I'm wondering about to come to your what's happening now in the US, but more generally with populism, isn't it the case that if people have lost, as you noted with the Manchester participants, they have lost the notion of which group they belong to? I mean, social class or union or whatever, but they still have this need for belonging and recognition. What is being offered is we now have a lot of potential bubbles, cultural bubbles that are ready to take you, right? Religious, political, or whatever. I mean, it could be anything from stamp collectors to Trump supporters or whatever. So just the fact of being there provides you with the recognition, whatever the motive is, because what you're looking for is just the feeling of being recognized as a part of the group, because we're social animals, basically. So is it the case that the more enemy there is, the more this kind of effect will be that people looking for recognition, that's all of us, will be easily grabbed by somebody who offers them some kind of recognition?
Mhm. Yeah, the approach I use here is focused less on if you will, the need for individualization, which would like this postmodern understanding of the self where people are not rooted and they just turn left and right to grab recognition. It's what I observe more in this study, in the previous book as well, is how people are fighting to reduce the stigma of their group, like how they engage in social movements to raise the status. So, and also it's not an essentialist understanding, you know about the argument of Jonathan Haidt and tribalism, this idea that we're all wired to want to value the group we belong to and put down the others. And instead, I've really spent my life studying the transformation of group boundaries and how they are made more porous. So, what we find here, to elaborate a little bit on what's happening with the Trumpian, I have an earlier paper that shows that in the 2016 election, Trump, in his 73 electoral speeches, really went out of his way to tell the workers, I value you, you are the salt, you're the backbone of the society, and you're having a hard time because of desindustrialization, and it's not your fault. It's because of China, and it's because of globalization, and it's about immigrant, and I'll take care of you. So he was really pouring recognition at them nonstop, and he's continuing to do it today. So that they embrace him at the same time as he's telling them, I'm just going to take care of you and ignore immigrants and everyone else. It's really this issue of, raising up the status of the group that they belong to and not the question of switching. So it's a kind of very different understanding of what the self is about. And the book is also very much focused on the process by which groups that have been historically deeply stigmatized, like people with HIV/AIDS, how the stigma against people with HIV/AIDS declined between 1980 and today. It's one of the groups that has become least stigmatized. And I showed that the key groups in there were knowledge producers, journalists, legal expert, medical expert, social scientist. So the point of all of this is that these boundaries are flexible and the structure of groupness is highly variable. So the focus is less on the action of the individual than on the transformation of group boundaries, if you will. But I am very familiar with the Tashfeld tradition, and it's the sociological approach in some ways is more focused on groups and less on individual choices. The version that you mentioned is one that Anthony Giddens, for instance, has very much focused on with individualization. So, yeah. But great question. Thank you. I know, Sadi, that this overlaps with your interests since you're a psychologist, and that's where our fields are connected. But there's a lot of differences, I think, in how sociologists handle these questions and how someone like Susan Fiske, for instance, does. Our approach is very inductive. So, yeah. Should
Thank
I
you
just
very much.
call the others, or do you want to call them for me?
I had Mathilde who wrote to me privately first, and then maybe Sophia, and then Tim.
Hey, a wonderful project. I had a question on the book and a question on the new project, but we can talk about it later as well. On the book, because it doesn't sound like it's part of the new project, I was wondering about the causal value or probative value or evidential value you attribute to cultural productions such as TV shows, YouTube videos, in group identification and stigmatization. It wasn't clear to me, what role these narratives were playing, you know, causally or
Sure.
in other ways. And then I'd love to hear more about the race in France new study, but maybe we can do that over coffee.
Yeah, well, the approach to explanation, I'm not talking about causality, I'm talking about explanation. I do explanation by looking at processes that unfold over time and what are the factors that enable and constrain different kinds of outcomes. So, for instance, in a previous book titled Getting Respect, Responding to Stigma and Discrimination in the US, Brazil, and Israel, we show that 5 different groups, Black, African American, Black Brazilian, Ethiopian Jews in Israel, as well as Palestinian citizens of Israel and Mizrahim, they all experience and respond to discrimination very, very differently. And we show what are the factors that enable and constrain different kinds of responses in each cases. So in the case of this book, Seeing Others, we study we don't study cultural processes, but it's one point in time. But we show that yes, the cultural production and diffusion, the book is a study of cultural production and diffusion. And what we're trying to explain is how can we make group boundaries more fluid, if you will, and we connect, the kind of we look at also those scripts of selves that become highly institutionalized, the neoliberal scripts of self, and the alternative of emergent scripts of self. So it's not a book that is as strictly connected to an explanatory logic as some of my previous books. And it's also a book for a general audience, so it's not following the same standards exactly as previous books, but that's basically it. The new book, the last chapter would be on what I call the impossible cases. I have written books in the past. I have a book titled The Dignity of a Working Man, Morality, Race, and Immigration in France and the US, which came out in 2000, where, I was really steeped then in the literature on race in France. And I showed that workers, Black and white workers in New York, white and North African workers in France draw very different kind of moral boundaries toward the poor and people above in the two societies, with very strong boundaries toward North African immigrants in Paris and very strong boundaries toward Blacks in the US. So this is a book that very early on was showing how cultural membership is defined differently in the two countries. So for this book, I would update myself on the most recent literature on race in France, which frankly, I don't think it has changed that much since so many people are still defending the Republican dominant ideology, just as in the US, people are defending American. So that chapter would be made of, the impossible cases would be sexuality people cannot claim membership based on their sexual orientation in Senegal or in China, or religion in China, race in France. So really cases where the dominant ideology of the country in which they live really closes pathways for seeking recognition and I have yet to decide whether this book will just be a scientific book or will be a book for a wider audience. I'm still very much another part of the book is in-depth interviews I'm Canadian, so 2 hours north of where I grew up, you have First Nations who are fighting to defend their environment in the context where there's a nuclear site disposal being built next to the Ottawa River. And I have a graduate student who's from Saipan, which is in Micronesia. We're doing a comparison of how Indigenous people in both contexts are seeking recognition through work and through the defense of the environment. So that's another paired case study. So I'm still in the process and these interviews are really, we're in the middle of doing them as well. So the book is still very much, in process, and I'm going to see how it all comes together and whether it can be a book or not. So that's where I am now.
Thank you. Sophia, next.
Sure. Thank you. This is very interesting. I have a pretty basic question, but I was struck by the choice of Manchester, New Hampshire in particular, also Manchester, England. Both have very distinct political identities as places. Manchester, New Hampshire is actually not typical of the way New Hampshire itself isn't typical. And I'm wondering whether you'd sort of try to control for the particular politics of the place, the local culture in some sense, or whether you're interested in how political ideologies shape strategies for recognition. Because I imagine you would see something quite different in a place that, for instance, had a libertarian tradition like New Hampshire, largely than you would, I don't know, in the West or something. But perhaps that's not the case. Perhaps these transcend
Mm-hmm.
forms of politics. So I'm curious how politics comes
Why?
into this.
Yeah, why this comparison? Well, the idea when I was invited to spend a month in Manchester, England, 2 years ago, which is how this comparison took shape. And I also have a summer place in New Hampshire, and there's a lot of French Canadian who moved to Manchester, New Hampshire, and I'm French Canadian. That's one reason I was interested. But the idea was really birthplace of the Industrial Revolution in both countries, very strong working class roots, strong history of strikes parallel that's interesting. Of course, there's a lot of differences across, but any comparison, there are differences. And New Hampshire is a purple state. Sometimes it's red, sometimes it's blue. And whereas northern England, it's much more, they voted for Brexit, but there's also a long working class. So the question, it's not about controlling. This is not a logic of generalizability. It's a logic of it's critical case analysis. So it's more like looking at patterns of similarity and differences. And the goal is not to generalize. So we were simply, this is a context in which we want to look at whether and how workers in both contexts are seeking recognition through politics and how are they doing it. So the how is really about studying the process. So that, if you will, is the methodological approach to it. We don't want to generalize, but at the same time, there's this really old and extremely rich tradition of comparing the US and the American working class that we're going to be connecting to. And actually, the conference where I am now today at LSC, Mike Savage, who we're celebrating, has had very important contributions in the huge literature on class voting and class culture in the UK. So that's one reason I'm here today.
Just to clarify slightly, I think maybe I didn't say this quite right. How much does ideology matter? The ideology that people bring, the politics that they bring to the process, even if they're as workers, whether they're MAGA, say, or whether they're socialists, or does that matter?
I think the notion of ideology doesn't hold much water anymore for the working class because they're largely, the right and left is totally now becoming irrelevant. A lot of it is moral boundaries, and they just draw different kinds of moral boundaries. There's a greater focus now on the place of emotion, especially for people who are not college educated. They may try to gain expertise by spending a lot of time on the internet, but there's also enormous distrust toward expertise. So I'm also co-authoring with two a young German and a young Dutch political sociologist an article on how can we reframe and understand working class politics today in a context where so many non-voters, the modes of participation have changed enormously. And I was talking yesterday with Nona Mayer, who's a leading French political sociologist who works on discrimination. And she said, in fact, there's been a steady increase in tolerance in France, but a lot of the people who are tolerant are not voting. So we really have to reconceptualize the place of ideology as we think about polarization in politics, because so many people are not voting. So.
Great. And Ine next.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation and also the book, which I really like. And I did maybe want to ask about the nature or the substance of the recognition that you are talking about, because Sadi just mentioned something about, belonging to a group of stamp collectors, so to speak. And I wonder if that is really sufficient or if that is really the substance, or if we are more talking about recognition as rights-bearing citizens, recognition as members of a polity. So in a way, I mean, you're obviously coming from sociology, but I kept wondering about the role of the state in all this. And then as I did, I was obviously also wondering, my field is transitional justice, about what can possibly be learned from settings where there were big programs aimed at recognition, notably after, for example, large-scale conflicts. I mean, in my field, you would have voices saying, reparation programs, for example, they're not necessarily perceived as meaningful when they repair, but they're perceived as meaningful when they manage to restore or to recognize people as, kind of reestablishing their status as citizens, reestablishing the link between the citizen and the state, and the recognition that really emanates from the state more than from social groups, so to speak. And so I was wondering if you would also want to speak a bit more about whether that's a specific kind of recognition to you and how relevant that is, that recognition by the state.
I would say that where recognition by the state comes up in our interview is basically in their anti-DEI attitudes. You know, the idea, especially among men, that they've been deeply penalized by some of the policies that the government has been pushing, mostly diversity policies. In general, you mention their rights as bearers of rights or the polity. I don't think those are concepts that are present among the people that we're studying. You know, they view random sampling. You know, we don't have any civil servants. Even there's quite a bit of difference between the people we're studying in New Hampshire and the people that are now being interviewed in the UK in the presence of the state in their lives, you know, like they don't have framework to think about, you know, when you say, you ask them, are you a member of a union? What's a union? You know, like the world that they inhabit is a world that is very, very different, I think, than the categories that political theorists use to think about these things. And even the notion of rights, like I think they're very upset about trans people who are involved in sports because they feel like their daughters shouldn't have to compete. There's some things like this that they feel extremely strongly about, but they don't think of themselves as citizens. The Habermasian model of citizens being involved in the polity, I think, is just very, very abstract for them. That's not how they would think about it. So I'm sorry, that's what I see. I think we need to revisit some, like the political science model that focuses on non-voters as people who lack information. I think there's a lot of things we need to revise in the way that these questions are approached. But I hope, Tina, that we'll have a chance to discuss this face to face. That would be very interesting.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Yes, and this is all the time we have for this part of our speaker series. So thank you so much, Professor Lamont.